Thank you very much. Welcome, Yepoka. And I should start by congratulating you on your book. It's an amazing book. Here it is. It really is a riveting read. It's gripping. It's arrived on a tide of rave reviews, and deservedly so. It really is a fantastic tale, and it's great to see that it's getting the attention and the appreciation that it deserves. I suppose the place to start is the protagonist of this book is not Anansi, is it? Despite the title. So who is the protagonist? And then we can come back to who Anansi is later, but who is the sort of anti-hero of this book?
John Meza, who, when we start out, is a petty con man. Like, he's stealing a few hundred CDs here or there, and he's jumping bail. And he very rapidly becomes a very good con man.
So what is it how does he become a good con man? What is it about his upbringing, his background that enables him to become so good at this?
He was incredibly intelligent, according to basically everyone, and he was a quick study. He would pick up on details that most people wouldn't notice, like ticks, exactly what you were wearing, exactly what you were up to, exactly the way you spoke. And he was really, really good at sort of mimicking and blending in. And it helped also that he had to work as a child and was exposed to so many people so quickly, and that the fact that he had to make a living meant that he had to get very, very good at talking to people. And so initially he sold kerosene as a child, and he somehow spanned this into working as a sort of spiritual leader / traditional doctor, also when he was a child.
And then he ends up in America for a bit as well, and that's sort of part of the story.
He does, yeah. He goes because he tells everyone he has a scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania, which he did not. But he duly showed up in Philadelphia. He worked at the Union League for a time, and he stayed in a row house with a bunch of other Ghanaian students who were enrolled at the university. And by all accounts, he was just as charming and rakish as he was everywhere else. And then he decided in a few years after that to go back to Ghana and attempt to contact President Nkrumah.
And then that brings us to the sort of central story. So what was the particular tale that he was spinning that drew people in?
And so about a decade later, this would emerge, and it happened right after President Nkrumah died. John Meza, said that he had had a sort of secret but very deep relationship with the president, and that on his deathbed, the president had entrusted him with this great secret, which was that because Nkrumah was aware he had enemies and there were so many attempts on his life, he developed an incredibly convoluted plan to move a huge chunk of Ghana's wealth away so that none of the people conspiring against him could get their hands on it. And so all this money and all this gold and all these diamonds, according to which stage of the con you were introduced to the story, were stored away in Swiss banks, and Meza was to be responsible for fulfilling all the administrative needs and calming the bankers down and reclaiming the money. But it was so much money that while the bulk of it was going to Ghana and would be used to develop the country, Meza would keep a part as sort of a payment for his work. And if you helped him do this, if you helped him cover the costs of this very complicated deal, you'd get maybe a 10-to-1 return, maybe 100-to-1 return on your money.
So it's sort of it sounds like an early 419 scam.
Yeah.
I have all this money over here and I can't get to it, but if you give me some money, I can unlock it and then I'll pay you back. Who were his victims And how was he exploiting preconceptions about Ghana at the time?
So in Ghana itself, his victims were mostly politicians and businessmen, and he sort of targeted politicians who had been either jailed for corruption or otherwise disavowed by Kwame Nkrumah, which I thought was fascinating. And also just business people who had money to burn and who, because they were also likely storing away money in Swiss banks, understood how this was possible. In Philadelphia, he initially targeted like a prison chaplain who was sort of radical and who was incredibly, like, he knew a great deal about Ghana and a great deal about liberation struggles in Africa in general. And it was a chance at, I think he called it economic liberation. And however, they needed money to get him a lawyer and get him out of jail. And so they brought on the man who would become Les Mis' partner in this, Robert Ellis. And he was a businessman. He'd been working since he was a kid. He delivered soda. And so all the people he knew around Philly were other business people, lawyers, doctors, people who had spare money to spend on a very speculative investment.
Is the subtitle, "The Man Who Looted the West, Outfoxed Washington and Swindled the World"? Looting the West is, given the colonial history here, and given the amount of stuff we have in our Western museums that was, as you might say, controversially procured, this sort of reverse looting, which is where the gullible people in the West were the victims of this, that sort of just gets bigger and bigger as the scam gets bigger, doesn't it? So there's a sort of darkly comic justice to all of this, isn't there?
Yeah. A big part of convincing people was that Blameza wouldn't say much. He'd sort of arrive dressed in the finery of a chief, with a lot of gold and surrounded by advisors and staff, and sort of sit there. Sometimes he would say something, sometimes he wouldn't, but just the sight of him would lead people to like a whole bunch of conclusions, to the point that it didn't matter what he said. Like if somebody else had like told him the tale and then they just looked at him 10 minutes, they'd be convinced. He was really, really good at manipulating people's preconceptions and looking like exactly who they needed him to be. And so if they wanted to take advantage of like a rube who didn't know what he had, he would look like that. And if they wanted to interact with a serious businessman who actually had access to all this money, he would look like that.
So I think one of the most impressive things about this book, I mean, it really is like a heist movie. It's like a kind of, it's true crime, but it's also like, Ocean's 11 or something, is that you manage to transmit the convincing nature of the con man through to the reader. So we're reading it, we're like, yeah, obviously this is all rubbish, but actually maybe there's just a chance it could be true. And you don't kind of want to give up on that. And then you keep reading it, and you're like, well, maybe there could still be a twist. And so and you keep that going really all the way throughout the book. So that is both a testament, I think, to your writing, but it's also a testament to how convincing he was, and how much of a chameleon he was, and able to be a blank slate that other people could just sort of read into him whatever they wanted. When did you first hear about him? What's the sort of beginning of the origin of this book, and what led you to do this?
In 2016, my mom sent me a WhatsApp message. And it was one of those things that goes around on WhatsApp among the uncles and the aunties. And it was a clip of the 60 Minutes segment. So he's talking to Ed Bradley. He's on like a golden Louis XV chair. He's dressed in all his finery. And the thing that I was interested in particular was that my mom said, "Do you think what he said is true?" And my mom is otherwise like a very serious person, so it was kind of a funny question coming for her and coming from her. And then I was like, obviously it's not. But then the next few weeks I kept talking to people and telling them this story, and they would be like, actually, I've heard worse. It's possible. People had stories about people who salted away money in an attempt to hide it from the IRS and then died. And so the family had no idea how to get a hold of this money. Lots of people from lots of different places in the world had like insane stories of like government graft and wealth legitimately being reclaimed from Swiss banks. And so at that point I was like, huh. And then I think the first bits of information I found were the diplomatic cables. Like I think the thing that did it was something between Shirley Temple Black, like the child star, who at that point was the American ambassador to Ghana, and Henry Kissinger, where Henry Kissinger is like, did we ever figure out if this was real?
Right.
That was the point at which I was like, okay, this is.
But also, you've got these big names right there, and I suppose the other thing is that this is probably where I should ask you who Anansi is, because this is very much in keeping with the tradition of Anansi. So, who is Anansi?
He is a figure of myth and legend. He is sometimes a man and sometimes a spider, and he is a trickster. And he is very good at talking people into things, convincing people. And because these stories are mostly to teach children about morality, usually he gets tripped up by his own stories. And
So he's a sort of just to read. I'm sorry to impose a sort of Western North European framing on this, but he's a sort of West African version of Loki then.
Basically, yeah. It's the same kind of god.
The trickster god. And who else do we have? There's a Mesopotamian version of him as well, isn't there? Whose name I've forgotten. But so you get this in mythologies, you get the kind of naughty character who is usually tripped up by their naughtiness.
Okay, like so charming and funny and interesting, but usually like they fail. And the thing with Anansi is that like once that's over and he's been humiliated, it's like, we'll live to another day. Whatever he spoke into being, whatever the trick was, would linger. And that was the most frightening thing about researching this book, because I'd go to look up a completely innocuous detail that everybody took for granted. And then I'd find out that it was basically the only source was like some propaganda from a military regime trying to convince everybody that like Kwame Nkrumah had 6 homes all over Africa and gold taps and gold toilets and stuff like that. And it would just be repeated all over and over and over again in the media and in the scholarship. And then once you traced it back to something completely unfounded, it was a little frightening.
So Anansi has the power, his lies become real and become impossible to kill. And yes. I think that's one of the many examples of how this story is timeless, because that feels very, very contemporary. That the big lie of whether that gold was there or not, and we talk about the big lie today, and also the kind of it's too good to be true, aspect of this, which we get with sort of crypto promises now. There's going to be an airdrop of these coins, and they're going to be worth lots of money in the future, and you should definitely buy Bitcoin and all this stuff. So evidently, Blaymazer was able to sort of channel that Anansi spirit and be very, very convincing. And I believe you have a passage that you would like to read that sort of illustrates that. Would you like to? Is this now a good time to read that? Because I think we should hear, not just talk about the book, but I think we should hear some of it. So is now a good time to ask you to actually read some?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to.
So over to you on for that then. Let's hear some of the actual book.
In January 1972, a car with fluttering diplomatic flags pulled up to the entrance of the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia. The gigantic Beaux Arts building was once known as the Grand Dame of Broad Street. Now it was the polished old world heart of a crumbling city. Outside the hotel's doors, Philadelphia was in the middle of one of the most precipitous urban declines of the century. The region used to make everything from Campbell's soup to Stetson hats to warships. The decline had started around the Depression. It had gotten worse during the Second World War. Now, the slow, steady drain of people and jobs had become a torrent. Over the course of the 1970s, Philadelphia would lose 140,000 jobs. Once grand buildings had been converted into halfway houses. Entire blocks lay derelict. The newspapers were full of advertisement for get-rich-quick schemes and business owners selling out after decades. The Bellevue would soon hit hard times as well. In 1976, an American Legion convention at the hotel triggered the first known outbreak of a pneumonia-like illness later named Legionnaire's disease. But in 1972, the Bellevue Stratford was still the center of its own gleaming universe. The lobby was all marble and polished brass. Higher up, the rooms had sweeping views of the city. Dr. John Ackerblay Mazer stepped out of the limousine onto an icy stretch of Broad Street. Blay had arrived in Philadelphia with a brand new name. He was welcomed by a frigid, bright winter day. Glancing up Broad Street, he looked with some satisfaction at the red brick Union League Club, then to the marble and granite grandeur of Philadelphia City Hall, all the way up to the statue of William Penn perched on the roof. The cold air caught his throat and made him feel alive. He had arrived. He ambled into the lobby of the Bellevue Stratford, introduced himself as a member of Ghana's delegation to the United Nations, and charmed the desk clerk. The doctor also presented a letter. It explained that he was a diplomat and that any charges would be settled by the Ghanaian embassy in Washington, D.C. The diplomat was escorted to a large suite. He rather liked looking down on the city from his perch high up in the hotel, biting an unlit cigar. Dr. Blay Mazer settled into life at the Bellevue Stratford. He spent days being driven around in the limousine with diplomatic flags, trailing a full retinue, and running a small time cons all over Philadelphia. His chauffeur would open the door and he would step out into the snow, draped in heavy ochre kente cloth, and just stand there like he had all the time in the world. The quiet center of a flurry of activity. Traffic would halt. Passers-by would stop dead in the middle of the sidewalk and gawk. For years afterward, people would talk about the African prince who came to town and took meetings with some of the wealthiest and best connected residents of Philadelphia. He was said to be selling gold straight from the motherland, and he apparently had a great number of takers. Wealthy investors would hand over large sums of money, and to celebrate, the prince would show them a great time in Philadelphia. They apparently had no idea he was entertaining them with their own money. In the evenings at the Bellevue Stratford, tables were laid with silver, and the dining room was lit with flickering candles and chandeliers. Philadelphia's high society gathered for dinner in the hunt room, the women with bouffant hairdos and the men in their double-breasted blazers, to remind themselves that despite what was going on outside, they still had a great deal of money. Blay Mazer made fast friends and reminisced about his days at the University of Pennsylvania. Sometimes he would lead the other guests in the Penn fight song. Dinner was served on gold-rimmed china. At the top of each plate, inside a gilded wreath, there were the letters B.S. Dr. Blay Mazer's bill was mounting, but the manager of the Bellevue Stratford had not yet called the Ghanaian embassy. So he never discovered that on January 13th, 1972, the day after Blay Mazer had checked into his hotel, the Second Republic of Ghana had been ended by force. I think I'll leave it there.
So that's a very nice example of one of his, I don't know, it's both skill, but it's also luck. that meant
Yes.
that he managed to avoid. And so when you're watching a heist movie, there's always a part where the heist is they've got all the plans, they've figured it all out, and you've got the guy with the triangle going tick ding tick ding tick, and they're saying we need a guy who can do explosives, and we need a getaway driver. So they've assembled the crew, but then there's always a point where it starts to go wrong, and you're on the edge of your seat because they're about to be discovered, and you have so many moments like this in the book, and you're like, surely now they're going to rumble him, and sometimes it's luck and sometimes it's political events. I mean, so what's happened in this case? It's a it's a coup and it's a political event in Ghana that's basically got him off the hook, right?
Yes and no. It got him off the hook briefly, momentarily, because he could just say that it was a misunderstanding and there was a change of government, and that's why his accounts were all messed up, and that's why nobody at the embassy knew what was going on. And then he kind of got caught up because his foundational story was based around the exact timing of these events, and it would come to like bite him in the ass, basically.
So he'd claimed to be at the deathbed
Yes.
when this whole sort of story was spun. And where was he actually at that point?
So after after his stay at the Bellevue Stratford, he gets hemmed up and is eventually arrested and charged with defrauding an innkeeper and sentenced to, I think it was 2 years at Greaterford Correctional Institute in Pennsylvania. And this is where he was when Kwame Nkrumah died.
Right.
Which not many people would notice until very, very late in the life of the scam. And this was also probably his biggest opportunity. This is what led to the organization that became the Oman Ghana Trust Fund, because he was great at reading a room. It's how he used current events to like create escapes and get away with things. And the minute President Nkrumah died, he realized he had a very, very clean, clear in.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I don't want to, obviously we don't want to, spoilers much. We don't want to go over the whole story, but it is a great story. I wanted to ask you a bit about the process of writing this book. So you got this fateful WhatsApp from your mum in 2016. Did you launch into writing a book right away? What kind of, what made you think, there's a book here?
I poked around for a bit, and I got like a chance to go to Philadelphia and see if I could find anything, like go to addresses, see if there were any court documents, that kind of thing. And it was like lots of inconclusive running around until the exact last day when I went to like 3 different records offices who finally sent me to the right place to get like old copies of court documents. And it was just the perfect experience. I went into the courthouse, I went up to a specific floor, and like I got in line, and like on one side of me there was like a bounty hunter who was actually dressed like a TV bounty. I was so excited. I'd never seen that in person. And like there were all these amazing court clerks who knew absolutely everything about the system and who could pull up cases. And so I got like a handful of files from that trip, because most of the stuff was like in storage. And it was just fascinating.
So that was the point where you kind of uncovered the seam, as it were, that you could then
there were documents, there was a trail, there were people. I also had a couple of trips to Ghana for other work where I just talked to people about Blame Mesa, and the stories were just like, they were unbelievable. They were literally unbelievable. They had to be apocryphal, except every time I would dig around and try to figure out where a story came from, apart from one, there'd be like a kernel of truth, and a lot of these stories actually panned out.
Right.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about the relationship between, I'm a journalist too, and I write books on the side, and for me, there's a very clear division. I write history books, but I do journalism mostly about technology in the future, and so they're very different. I'm switching gears in my brain. Your journalism, there's that amazing story you did about the fake US embassy. and in Ghana that was issuing people with fake visas. And it's very much, of a piece with, Anansi would totally be up for that. And so was this a sort of extension of your journalism, or was it for you a sort of interesting thing to be doing on the side?
I think it was originally an extension of my journalism. Like I just really liked going to a place I didn't know so well and like finding addresses and talking to people and figuring out if there was a story there, which was why like I went to Philadelphia a couple of times before I realized that I'd be doing this as a book. And also in Accra, which despite the fact that like I visited plenty of times as a kid, I'd never actually experienced as a place to work. So I was just really enjoying that, and it was mostly just talking to people until I understood the scale of what had happened, and that it was like there were heads of state involved in multiple countries. There were huge changes in like government and politics and like the economy that the Blamelese are either manipulated or directly benefited from. Then it sort of became a bit fiddlier as a story because now I had to stand up lots and lots of stuff that was not necessarily like heavily covered in secondary sources. So if I wanted to look up like a biography of one of the government leaders, I'd find maybe one thing from like the 1970s and nothing else. And so about like spent months and months trying to find secondary stuff and not getting anything, and realizing that I had to start tracking down primary sources. I had to look at accounts, newspapers, government documents, sort of at least 2 continents, and 3 actually, now I think about it. Yeah. And then it became, I guess, a little more like historical research, because I was digging around in the most comprehensive primary sources that I could, and that I think I enjoyed the most.
Well, I was going to say, what was the most fun part of the research? You like being in the dusty archives with all of the piles of stuff and filing your, requests to the archivist, and they bring you a box, and then you go through it. You go, oh, I found it. Is that the kind of thing that you like?
It was kind of half and half, because I also really, really, really enjoyed just like going to people's houses and trying to find out if they were comfortable enough to tell me about this like insane chapter of their lives. And also you just get to see how people live, and just if you're involved in this, you probably had like an appetite for immense risk. So in general, all the people I spoke to had incredible lives because they made like very, very daring decisions. But then there was like I went to Temple University because I had seen a reference to a paper that no longer existed, who had given all their archives to Temple. And by archives, they meant like the morgue from the paper, the Philadelphia Evening News. And so it was back when everything was cataloged in paper. So to find other stuff that the paper had covered previously, somebody was employed cutting out clips from the actual newspaper and folding them down to fit in these boxes, and then just like giving them a label like Bellevue Stratford or Temple University. And so the morgue was just boxes and boxes and boxes of crumbling paper, like news clippings from 1912 all the way until the paper shut down. That was a great deal of fun. And also because I was going to all these places where people do research, I would just randomly run into people. Like one of the days I was looking through the morgue, I heard a professor who would come in to pick something up, randomly talking about Blamelese. And it turns out he was a friend of one of the original investors, and his friend had wanted him to dig around and find out if there was still anything there.
Right. So those serendipitous encounters in the library with documents and with people
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. That's part of it too. This is obviously is a true crime story, and true crime has become a big thing, an even bigger thing in recent years. Why do you think that is? What is it you think that, sort of explains the appeal of true crime?
Um, More widely, I'm not sure, but I can speak for myself, and that's just that I like a good yarn that is messy and chaotic and trashy. Like, obviously, this isn't the case with all true crime. There are like aspects of a scam you can enjoy a lot more than like a homicide situation. But yeah, no, like initially when I was writing this, I just thought it was a really funny scam. And it appeared that he had only targeted people who could afford to lose money and gotten away with it. Like, as I dug around a bit more, it was clear that that was not at all the case. And there were just insane consequences to everything he did. But at the time, it just seemed really cool. And I would tell people about it, and they'd be like, oh, he only scammed rich people. Ha ha ha. It's an enjoyable tale.
So in that sense, that's the sort of catch me if you can aspect of it.
Yeah,
That it's sort of harmless fun by a sort of incredibly
yeah.
gifted con man. And where did you do most of the writing? How do you like to write? Do you have a kind of ritual where you have to be at a particular desk, a particular cup of coffee in a particular mug, and all this sort of thing?
Um, I kind of have like two modes, and one is that I have to be like at my desk and I have to have a specific kind of candle and a specific kind of music that like channels me towards hyper focus. And then
So
I'm
what
locked
music?
in.
What is that? Electronica, Keith Jarrett, classical music. And what's your writing music?
It kind of depends on my mood. Like there was a whole stretch where I could only listen to Japanese death jazz.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah, and then there was a whole stretch where I could only listen to the Isley Brothers.
I
It was
because
a
I can't write with anything that's got English lyrics. So if it's
yeah.
Puccini, I can that's fine. And if it's instrumental, I can that's fine too. But anything that's got lyrics in English, I'm just like listening to the lyrics, and I can't think straight. I can't do crosswords either. So you can tune that out.
Yes, because like my partner would come into the room and have a conversation with me and then leave, and then he'd come in and refer to the previous conversation, and I'd be like, I don't remember that happening.
So you're in the zone. Okay,
Yeah.
that's great. Yeah.
So that's one. The other is like I can't be anywhere near my desk. So I have to be like in a coffee shop in a different country, preferably like one that's vaguely connected to what I'm researching, surrounded by really interesting people who can distract me, but also where I can kind of feel the story out in a way that's not as formal as like sitting at your desk and like really focusing on the process of
Is
writing.
one of those a is one of those an editing mode and one of those a writing mode, as it were?
Um, yes, I think the writing mode is like coffee shops in
Right.
Philadelphia, and the editing mode is like
So people
very
say write drunk, edit sober.
yes, kind
So
of
you
like
want to
that.
be kind of expansive when you're writing and just like putting it all
Yeah,
out, and then you go back to it with a kind of clearer eye.
like
And
not putting up with any of your own nonsense kind of thing.
yeah, exactly. And what was the hardest part, did you find, of writing the book?
So I realized like once I'd got to the bit of research in the late 1970s that like his involvement in politics was more complicated than just like convincing leaders to back him or at least lend him their credibility. And then around the time I got round to like writing that and like filling out my research, one of Ghana's former like military leaders, Jerry Rawlings, died, and he was basically the reason that I couldn't go back to Ghana when I was a child. He tried to kill my dad several times, and so we couldn't go back in case that also happened to us. And so it was really weird because when he died, lots and lots of people like left these absolutely wonderful, loving tributes. Like he was thought of as like a great politician, a great public servant. He was always willing to like roll his sleeves up and get into the muck and do things. And it was really jarring because that was not my experience of him. And I think it hit me when my cousin posted like this really lovely tribute to him, and I was messaging her like, why? And it turned out that she didn't know why my mother and father had left the country. Like at no point had anyone told her that this very big monumental change in the way like my family could survive had happened. And that was deeply upsetting.
Right.
On its own. But then I realized to understand what Blade did next, I needed like to further understand the like political situation. So that's when I ended up doing a great deal of research into Ghana in the late 70s and early 80s and the two coups that were staged by Jerry Rawlings. And that was easily the worst bit.
So it's politically complex, but it's also personally very difficult for you to excavate all of that and work through that.
Yeah, and also because when I talked to my parents about it, it became clear that they had a lot of unresolved trauma. They had friends who just disappeared. They'd witnessed some awful things, and then they'd have to leave their families and their lives behind. And they hadn't really had a chance to process any of that before Jerry Rawlings laundered his reputation and became like a respected world leader. Yeah, and also it was just, even though I knew what had happened and I'd read about it, it was only when I had to systematically go through the National Reconciliation Commission report with very specific details of what people said happened that I realized just how widespread and just ghastly the violence was and how unnecessary all of it was. It was like a bloodbath for the sake of a bloodbath. And
so there was this, your sort of impartial historian journalist persona comes into conflict with the actual family history and the trauma that meant for your family, and you had to reconcile those two.
And I think the hardest thing was realizing that like people had so just wonderfully, effectively, thoroughly laundered their reputations that nobody was talking about the absolutely awful stuff they had done. Like they'd also just guaranteed like in the new constitution that they could never be charged for anything that had happened. But also then they just had convinced like generations of people, only like slightly younger than me, that they were great leaders who had never done anything wrong. And I found this a lot. It wasn't just with like Joe Rawlings or the people around him. It was the same with the way people thought about Nkrumah. The most common stories about him always went back to allegations that were made during like a commission by the military. This was like taps, houses all over Africa, girlfriend with a Ford Thunderbird. And there'd been a bunch of these commissions, and in the first one, people had stated like Nkrumah did this, and then after that, it would be like, well, so what had happened is that Nkrumah told me to take this money and open a bank account in London at Midland Bank in the name of me and my wife, and then the next report, it would be like, well, I got the impression that Nkrumah wanted me to open a bank account in the name of me and my wife. And then like by the 70s, they had established that none of the allegations really stood up, but that didn't matter. Like the bullshit story from the beginning was the enduring one. And it was also like likely to be the one that popped up first if you were looking through archival stuff and trying to get a sense of like why there was a coup and why people had problems with Nkrumah.
So this sort of slippery nature of reality and people reinventing themselves and sort of coming up with different stories about what had happened in the past. I mean, that really comes through, and your protagonist is a sort of avatar for that broader phenomenon. Finally, the thing I wanted to ask at the end was sort of what's the kind of message, if any, that you want people to take away from this, because this sort of power of stories to convince people is one thing, and then there's also the sort of if something looks too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. What's the what would you say the kind of, you want people to walk away with concluding from all of this? Is there a single message?
I don't think there is. I think there's like a general, just like you said, if it sounds too good to be true, it's too good to be true. But also that we can't trust what we assume to be history, and everything deserves looking at like 2, 3, 4 times by lots of different people, because it's entirely too important to leave to a handful of people, but it's also entirely too important to take at face value.
The people say history is written by the winners, but it sounds like you're saying history is written by the most convincing liars or the most convincing storytellers, to be a bit more
Yes, the most
charitable.
convincing
Yeah.
storytellers, who also happen to be the most convincing liars, usually.
Yes, they overlap a great deal. Um, so well, this book is has got the best start I think it can have. It's a great book. It's being well received. What I'm always asked this, so I have to ask you as well. Are you planning another book? Is there more to come in this vein? Where is this going to take you?
I don't know. I was basically like addicted to the research. Like friends would try and hold like interventions to stop me looking for new stuff. So I was digging up stuff, and stuff was getting released like at the National Archives right up until like my final versions were due. And so I haven't really had a breather.
Right. You
So
didn't discover anything along the way that was like, wait a minute, there's another story over here. I could definitely dig into that.
there were so many digressions. Like I have to go pull them out of an old draft, because there were so many things that I stuffed in there that did not need to be there and that I wanted to dig around in. But mostly I just want to go hang out in some archives and see what else there is.
You've caught the bug. Excellent.
Yeah.
You're going to do more than that. And then, I mean, this sounds like, the canonical format for true crime, obviously, is the podcast.
Yeah.
But it could also be a Netflix series. Where do you see this? Where do you see this going? If you could imagine this in other media, where do you, where would you choose to have this story told, and how would you tell it?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, so a podcast is really fun because I get to like go back to sources and documents and people who are involved even peripherally, and like have them tell their versions of what happened. And like you could kind of wander in different directions that you're not really able to do in a nonfiction book because it's just too much detail. Um, I
And
would also
you can hear from those people directly. So I mean, I assume that you're one handshake away from your anti-hero, like on multiple levels, right? There were so many people you must have spoken to who had direct contact, and they're all still around, and you could still. Did you record them? Have you got the raw material?
I mean, just for like notes, so they weren't particularly high quality recordings. A lot of people passed on during this process.
Right.
They were of that kind of age, and so that was one of the most frustrating things. And I also, one of my sources had tapes that Blaine Mesa had recorded when he was attempting to get out of house arrest, sort of towards the end of it. And they're just fascinating and chilling.
Sounds like you have lots of material for definitely for a podcast, or indeed a Netflix series or something else. Sounds like there's lots to be done there.
Yeah, I would love to see it on TV just for the possible costumes, like kipper ties, denim suits, all that good stuff.
Excellent, excellent. And then the final thing I wanted to ask you was, what sort of inspired you? Which books, um, you know, led you to want to write this kind of book, and what you're reading now that excites you. So what's on your bookshelf, both historically and what are you reading right now?
Um, there were so many books. I think the most obvious one is Catherine Boo's Behind the Beautiful Forevers. A couple by David Gran, a couple by Eric Lawson, and there were just like a ton of very specific histories that I really enjoyed because they filled out either a period or a place. Right now, I'm kind of sort of exhausted from all of this, and so I want to
So
catch up.
what's your escapism? You're reading like summer beach literature, sci-fi. I don't know. What are you into?
Yeah, I'm reading a lot of like, it's a terrible term, but it's like chick lit, but like African chick lit. So Peace Media's His Only Wife and her new one, Nightbloom. They're lovely because they are really accurate portraits of life in Ghana, and all the characters are just surprisingly familiar, but it's also like enjoyable and not insanely challenging. I'm also reading a ton of comics that I have to catch up on, so Monstrous and Saga mostly.
There you go. So a very, very broad spectrum of influences there. I think that's wonderful. Well, thank you very much. It's been really fascinating hearing about the story behind the book. A wonderful book, and you know, I really enjoyed it. I wish you all the best with it, and it really is fantastic to see it getting off to such a good start. And I think is this the first stop on your virtual media tour?
I think it is,
I
yeah.
think it is. So I'm privileged to be here to give this
It's a
book the
pleasure.
biggest push I possibly can. And now I'm going to hand us back to our host, who's going to wrap things up. But thank you very much indeed. I've really enjoyed hearing all about it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you all being here.